So we've been having conversations and presenting data about the specific things that are happening within this context, net energy metering battles, changes in rate structures, but there are broader questions there as well around how solar interacts with utilities now and how utilities approach solar, both distributed solar and utility scale, and where that's headed over the longer term. So we've assembled a really fantastic panel here to talk with us about it, and a group of people who all have different sort of lenses on this question. So I'll do a brief introduction for all of you, and then I'll give you all a chance to give us some more detail. So beginning to my immediate left, we have Tom Stars. Tom is an old hand in the solar industry and also the VP of Market Strategy and Policy at SunPower, and I know heavily involved in a lot of the regulatory questions around distributed solar in the US. Then we have Dave Frankel, who is an associate principal at McKinsey and has authored some really great influential research on solar as a disruptor to utilities and what that means for utility business models. I think also does some consulting for solar companies as well. And then we have Julia Ham, who is the president and CEO of the Solar Electric Power Association. SEPA literally sits right at the nexus of solar and utilities. SEPA is a trade association comprised largely of utility members, helping them figure out solar. So you're in the perfect spot for this conversation. And finally, James Avery, who's the Senior Vice President of Power Supply at SDG&E, our local utility here, providing the power that allows these lights to remain on. So before we get started, I've been asked to ask the audience a question, which is, are there any public utilities commissioners or advisors currently in the room? Raise your hand if there are. It's fine. We're not going to hate you. None. Great, you could say whatever you want. I swear, nobody else will hear it. Fantastic. So I want to sort of dive right into it, and I'll let you guys do an introduction of yourselves as we get through the first question. And I will say, you know, this is a panel topic that I think happens at like every solar conference in the country now. Solar and the utility of the future, solar utility nexus. It always happens. And a lot of the time, at least it seems to me, we end up having the same conversation. So I want to see if we can dig a little bit deeper here and have a conversation that is a little bit more actionable than talking just in the clouds about, you know, whether utilities are going to go through a death spiral, for example. So let me start by handing it to Tom, because I know you're involved across a lot of different states and you're sort of monitoring what's happening broadly. Can you just paint us a picture of what has been happening over the past couple of years, specifically with regard to regulatory clashes between the solar industry and utilities? How would you define what's happened thus far?
Great question. I think we touched a little bit on that in the last panel. I think one, to me, sort of a touchstone in terms of a key date was the Edison Electric Institute's, EEI's, publication of its Disruptive Challenges Report, which was, what, January 2013. Yeah. And I think there's been a lot of activity that followed from that that reflected really EEI's report sort of permeating through the utility industry, and I think has driven a lot of the changes that we've seen utilities proposing. I think one key element of that, as we also highlighted in the last session, is that I think the strategy has shifted. So I agree. I'm trying to remember who it was on the last session. But it was Sanjay who noted that I think the utilities started out by really attacking net metering pretty directly. I think they saw that that tactic was a challenging one for them to succeed in. So I think we've seen a pretty significant shift away from that and towards utilities taking the initiative to essentially, rather than eliminating net metering, undermining the value of net metering through different rate design proposals. And again, Sanjay, I think, hit on a couple of the major ones. To me, the most evident and frankly the most troubling is the shift, utilities seeking a pretty substantial shift from variable to fixed monthly bills, which radically undermines the solar industry's value proposition to its customers. I also think it's bad public policy from a variety of other perspectives. I think there's other ways for the utilities to meet their legitimate goals of making sure that they recover, you know, at least some of the costs of serving customers from customers other than going to fixed monthly charges. So I think that's sort of one tranche. I think the other thing that's perhaps even, well, as significant, perhaps even more significant over time, is the recent proceedings that are going on in a few key states, and there's others, but the ones that I consider the most interesting are California, Hawaii, where I just returned from. I spent a week, all of last week in Hawaii, and New York, which has its own Reforming the Energy Vision, or RAV, proceeding underway. So, to me, all three of those are representative of the fact that we're going. To me, they demonstrate that we're making the transition from just talking. There's been a lot of rhetoric about the utility business models and the challenges of and disruptive impacts of solar, to actually seeing very real regulatory proceedings underway, which are addressing these issues in a serious way, and with, in some cases, really very dramatic and bold changes. I think for those that haven't read it, I think one of the most interesting documents I've ever seen come from a Public Utilities Commission is what people refer to as the Inclinations study, or Inclinations white paper, that was published by the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission last April. So if anyone has not seen that and is interested, just let me know, and just give me a card and I'll email it to you. But it's really an extraordinary document, really a vision, a roadmap for a renewable fueled future in a state that is better equipped than virtually any other to make that kind of transition.
And how could everyone not have seen it with a sexy title like the Inclinations paper? Let me move on to Dave. So you're consulting with a lot of utilities and sort of getting the inside view onto how they're approaching this. I think one thing that would be interesting to hear, because a lot of times at solar conferences, I feel like we sit in an echo chamber where we talk about utilities specifically that are in the middle of some waging war or some regulatory discussion. But I wonder if you could speak more broadly to your impression of how much utilities are thinking about solar, either as an opportunity or as a threat, and to what extent that's dictated by whether they're in a state with a lot of solar installations, or is everybody thinking about this now?
Yeah. I would characterize it as a very broad range, actually. So I think there's, on one hand, I think you've got a set of the utilities that are well aware of what's going on with respect to the technologies and all of the related implications, and are actively either refining strategies or developing strategies associated with that. There is a continuum, though, right? I mean, I got a call not too long ago from a utility that said my board actually just asked me for a strategy as it relates to solar. Right, so, and I do think that it's related in part to where individual territories are as it relates to overall economics in terms of the urgency that they're feeling. But it is a pretty broad continuum overall in terms of what we're seeing. And I think, what is interesting is over time, right, even for the utilities that have a pretty clear sense that it's a real threat and that they need to do something about it, the challenge that a lot of them are having is how do you actually develop an integrated view across, the customer business, energy supply, my grid ops folks, my regulatory folks, because the reality is, this is really a cross-functional challenge that utilities are faced with and that they have to address.
Right.
And can I just chime in? So I think the other thing we have to keep in mind, and I know a lot of the conversation this morning has focused on the investor-owned utilities, but I think what type of utility we're talking about plays in here as well to that question, because we actually heard a little bit in the earlier panel, municipal utilities and co-ops in particular, they can act much faster typically than an investor-owned utility can. So we're seeing some really innovative things coming out of the, actually co-op. I would actually point to the co-ops first as being the most innovative in this space right now, followed by the munis. As an example, there's a co-op called Wright Hennepin in Iowa who has a very comprehensive solar strategy in place in a state of like Iowa. Who would have thought a small co-op in Iowa? But they really are looking at it in 3 phases that they're rolling out over the next 12 months. The first phase is community solar. They already have a community solar program offering to their customers, but they're expanding the program, so that's phase 1. Phase 2 is that they, in early 2015, are rolling out a rooftop and solar pedestal offering to their C&I customers. And then in the second half of 2015, they're rolling out a residential rooftop leasing program to the residential customers. And they're doing all of this in a model very similar to what the solar industry is used to in terms of these are $0 down financing program options, and they are offering their customers the opportunity to lock in long-term fixed rates for those that participate. So, there's an example of a small cooperative utility who has been studying what all of you are doing and saying, okay, well, what can we do to have an offering for our customers? And I can tell you, I mean, very similar to what we just heard from Dave, we spend, SEPA's been around since 1992. And by the way, we're not a trade association, we're a C3, so we do not exist to serve our members' interests. We exist to serve our mission. But we've been around since 1992, and I will tell you, in the past 2 years, we have a team of people who is pretty much spending all of their time in conversations with utility executives and utility boards. And that's really just been happening over the past 2 years. It is now something that is on their every meeting agenda that they're talking about these issues. So we're spending a lot of time helping utilities think about, okay, how do we, we've thought about it as a threat, but how do we turn this into an opportunity, and how do we do it in a way, and from SEPA's perspective, we're always in there saying, how do we do it in a way that's a win-win for both the utility and the solar industry and the customer? So things have really evolved very quickly in the past 2 years. To Tom's point about sort of that January 2013 mark, I think really was a sort of turning of the corner.
Right, yeah, and I want to come back to some of the ideas and solutions that have been proposed that do meet everybody's needs. But in the meantime, let's move on to James, our lone utility representative on the panel. So James, why do you hate solar? No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I want your perspective from the other side of the meter here, because we're at a solar conference. You're surrounded by people who are want solar to keep growing. I think you would probably argue SDG&E also wants solar to keep growing, just in a sustainable fashion.
It's interesting. I've sat here now for the last couple of hours and listened to people vilify me for somehow disparaging or hating or fighting solar. I think there couldn't be anything further from the truth. My company, and by the way, I think we should start by saying we talk about municipals, we talk about costs, we talk about investor-owned utilities. There are also drastically different types of investor-owned utilities. And I think one of the major differences of my company versus a company that might be in Iowa or somewhere else is we are fully decoupled. That means if my sales cut in half because half my customers went solar, or my sales doubled because everybody added an air conditioning unit, my profits to my shareholders don't change. So from that standpoint, there's no perverse incentive for me to oppose any form of distributed solar or rooftop solar, or whether it's out in the deserts. But at the same token, I have a responsibility to protect the interest of my customers. And we talk about some of the things that Jay said exactly right on point, the notion of how quickly can we respond to market changes and market demands and what our customers are looking for. We put a solar initiative out, and it took our commission 3 years to address it. We have had now at our commission, I think it's getting close to 3 years, a request to do community solar. So while there are things our customers demand and want, our hands are quite often, our arms are shackled, and we don't have the authority to do these things. Now, having put all of that aside, in the last 2 years, we've added well over 1,000 megawatts of solar to our system. And I think if I go back 10 years ago, our system as a utility was less than half of 1% renewable. Today, we're at 32%, and that's not counting the behind-the-meter distributed resources. That's just resources that we have added, and about half of that is solar in nature. From our standpoint, we're relatively indifferent as to what resources we acquire, but we have an obligation to acquire resources on behalf of our customers. And one of the things I quite often get vilified is, well, you should be doing more in this particular area, and you shouldn't be adding a gas turbine. Well, the problem I have is, quite often, distributed solar is installed wrong. It's put in with the intent of optimizing its production at noontime. Yet we as a utility peak between 2 and 9 p.m., which means I still have to add something to serve that peak demand at the end of the day. Now, I'm hopeful that there'll be other forms of resources we can do, such as energy storage in the future, But right now, the only resource that I have available to do this are conventional gas turbines. So it makes people look at me and say, well, they're obviously opposed to solar because they're adding gas turbines. And that just could not be further from the truth. We look at a lot of the questions that you saw up here earlier, and we quite often try to also put it into the context of this is a battle between rooftop solar and the utility company. Well, if I can actually contract for a solar power that sits in my eastern county or sits somewhere in my system or even in the desert, and effectively it's a fraction of the cost of other resources for the customer, that's what I have to do. We follow a prescribed plan that we helped create here in California, where we look at the least cost, best fit resource to meet our customers' needs. And we follow down that path to pursue that type of resource. And people say, well, you should put a carbon tax on the fossil alternative. Well, we do. We do look at that from the standpoint of what is the all-in cost for our consumer. And the notion of, well, the utility must be against solar because it wants to reform its rates. Again, it couldn't be further from the truth. The fact of the matter is, the people who are sitting out here trying to sell energy storage should be the ones screaming the most about the fact that, wait a minute, this tariff that's in place today incents one kind of behavior, but it actually penalizes somebody else from being part of the equation. Right now, we have situations where our rates were designed based upon the way we billed for services 20 or 30 years ago and the way we acquired resources 20 and 30 years ago. They don't reflect the costs of doing business today. And people look at it and say, well, the utility is trying to raise its fixed charges because it's trying to stop something. No, that's not the case. What we would like to do is for everything to be transparent, people to see our costs. Now, in my case, and again, I'll look at it from San Diego's perspective, 75% of my costs represent the transmission, the distribution wires to move power around the system. And my residential customers peak at 8 p.m. They've peaked at 8 p.m. for 20 years. And the notion that I can do something and avoid my total cost and I shouldn't have to contribute, that means somebody else has to pay for it. And that's all we're trying to do, is to make sure that people have the proper price signal. If they have the proper price signal, first off, I think our customers will start aiming their panels further west. And that's good for us. It actually makes solar be a big part of the equation to solve the problems we have.
Right, right. So I think that's actually a great representation of like a very well, eloquently worded, pretty standard utility response to one of these. Not saying it's a bad thing, but you've basically well articulated what, we are not against solar, we are for solar, especially in a decoupled environment. We have no reason to be against solar. And not only that, but the rate structures are sort of anachronistic already, and what we're trying to do is just get them right. Tom, I'd love you to sort of represent the counter-argument there.
Well, I think there's a lot that Jim said that I actually agree with. I think there's, and so let me start there. I think that, let me actually not start there, but extend that. So I think one of the areas where I think Jim and I would agree is that as the market penetration of solar, both distributed and large-scale solar, increases, it does create grid integration challenges. I think one of our survey questions in the last session reflected that. So that is a legitimate concern for everyone in the room and all the utilities and the solar industry alike. And to me, that's represented, as Jim well knows, in California by the somewhat infamous duct chart, the CalISO's duct chart. And I think, to me, what's interesting is that I'm starting to see signs of a transition. When the duct chart was published roughly 2 years ago, I think the implicit message was, if we're going to have all this solar that peaks at noon, and yet our system peaks in the evening, then we have a problem. And this is the important point. At that point, 2 years ago, the answer to that problem, again, implicit, not explicit, but I think it was pretty clear, was we need more new gas-fired generation and more transmission, essentially, to fix that problem. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I'd love to flip this back to Jim and the rest of the panelists to get their view, is that I think, not today, not tomorrow, but with the increasing availability of a variety of energy management capabilities, demand response capabilities, other load shifting capabilities, driven ultimately by the availability of storage. The DG solar, which today Jim sees as part of the problem, can be part of the solution, right? To use a time-worn cliche. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, you know, another way to resolve Jim's problem is not to shift panels to the west, which a lot of us in the room are going to fundamentally disagree with because it decreases the overall performance of the system, but rather have the ability to essentially deliver that power to your battery bank and feed it, you know, at noon when the sun's at its peak, and then deliver it back to the grid between 6 and 8 or 9 p.m. when the system is at its peak. Now, that's just a microcosm, but I think that principle, that idea, you know, sort of writ large, scaled up, means that we do have the potential for DG solutions defined more broadly than just PV on the roof, really can contribute significantly to addressing the challenges that we're all facing with respect to grid integration. To me, it's not interesting to talk about 5% or 10% solar penetration. We have a global imperative in the form of the climate crisis to resolve. We all know, we've all seen the numbers, that, you know, we don't need to get to 30 or even 33% or even 51% renewables, but 80% renewables over time. We've got a few decades, maybe, to do that. But to me, that's the ultimate bogey, and we need to be thinking about mechanisms for integrating the available renewable resources, of which solar is one of the least expensive and most abundant, and most available, into the grid at that kind of penetration. And that, I think, is our joint mission, essentially.
And actually, I hate to say this, I agree with you.
No, you love to say that. You love to say that.
But I think the critical point here is, for example, in rate design, the rate design that's out there today discourages customers doing exactly that. Customers actually putting a battery in conjunction with solar to make solar be part of the equation. And I mean, just a simple change of rates that reflect the time of day so that customers can have an option to do something. So a customer can actually manage their homes better. I really think the customer is the biggest opportunity for the solution to the problem. Right. I don't think it's the utility. I don't think it's the solar providers. I don't think it is the customer who has the best opportunity. And unleashing that potential by giving the customers the price signal provides them the opportunity to be part of this equation. Yeah. Until that happens, and it's really kind of an interesting thing that's occurred over the last 10 to 12 years, is our load factor, the efficiency of our system, has gone down virtually every year over the last 13, 14 years. And it's happening because the rate design is actually incenting people to be less and less efficient. And until we can get to a point where the rates actually promote efficiency, then the customer isn't going to want to be part of the equation. I mean, part of the thing we have right now is those customers who are putting storage in and they're in conjunction with their solar projects are doing it based upon the price signals they're receiving today, and they're actually quite often detrimental to the system. Because what they might be doing is actually getting more of their storage to be producing in the middle of the day or in the shoulder hours in the middle of the day, which again, if they had the proper price signal, they could actually produce it at a time of the day that benefits the grid. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm saying the best opportunity is for making this a good market, not just for solar, but for solar and more demand response, more energy storage and different types of technologies, and the opportunity for the customer to be unleashed.
Right. I want to take a step back for a second, rather than sort of continuing to dive as deeply as we can into rate structures, and hand it to Dave and then Julia. I'm curious, you mentioned, you said you had a utility recently that gave you a call and said, my board of directors said we need to come up with a plan for distributed solar. When that happens, what's the approach? What are you thinking about, and kind of what's the range of strategies that you think are available to utilities when they're thinking about that?
Well, so I think the first step for any utility is to really understand in their specific territory what's the nature of the threat, quote unquote, right? So understanding the economics. I mean, there is still a huge range in terms of awareness of where costs are heading in some cases. And then what does that mean for different tiers of customers, right? So the first thing we do is we go in and we actually just do all the modeling, right? And smaller utilities sometimes just haven't done it. Mm-hmm. From there, it's a discussion typically around, what do you do, to kind of get your core operations and your core house in order, if you will. Not to say it isn't always in order, right? But, as we're talking about on the grid, right? I mean, big part of this is how do you really set up the grid over the future to be flexible, particularly on the distribution side? how do you think about things like efficient deployment of capital so that you're actually putting, into an aging grid, you're putting dollars into a system in ways that actually will allow for the flexibility that we're talking about here.
Right.
And as an aside, I think it's very consistent with what everyone's saying on the panel around growing the pie as opposed to fighting what's happening. And then the other thing that we oftentimes, a couple other things we oftentimes talk about. One is how do you, utilities for the most part still own the customer, right? And so there is this question of how do you actually continue to own the customer? How do you in fact delight the customer? Because the reality is, and we see this often in retail, in financial services, in the telecom industry, right? The utility industry actually has to move to being more customer focused and being able to create a suite of products that are truly customizable, right? Whether it's EE, DR, storage, solar, it's the whole shebang. And finally, the last part of the conversation often is, how do you help utilities kind of participate in the upside, if you will, right? And there's a whole variety of ways to do that in front of the meter, behind the meter. The panel before talked about a lot of that as well. But really, for us, it's about kind of protecting the core and, in fact, shoring up the core, and then figuring out the right way in that territory to actually participate.
Right, and that's actually a perfect segue to Julia, because SEPA recently announced this new initiative, 51st State. I'm curious to have you briefly explain it, but then I really want to know what you're hoping to see. It's proposals from the world about what the next sort of a redesigned electricity market could be. What would you like to see?
Sure. So we announced something called the 51st State Initiative. Essentially, we as an organization have been thinking for a long time as we've been watching sort of these regulatory and rate-based battles happening. What can we do to constructively participate in the conversation? And so what the 51st State Initiative does is recognize the fact that when you're in the reality, let's take Arizona as an example, seems to be a good one, right? When you're in a situation in a specific state like Arizona where you have your existing regulatory design, paradigm, you've got your electricity market design, you've got your rate structures, it's very hard to think outside the box about what could be possible because you have to you're in your status quo, and so you're always thinking incrementally about how can we incrementally change from where we are today. And so what we're looking to do with the 51st State Initiative is essentially say, forget the status quo for a while. Imagine there's a brand new state. It doesn't have any pre-existing electricity market design. There's no utility rate structures. How would you design a market from a complete scratch, blank slate, in order to maximize the potential or really reach the potential of not only solar, but all distributed energy resources, while at the same time making sure that you are able to provide a grid that is safe, reliable, affordable for all customers. And so the initiative we're looking for, it's a crowdsourcing initiative. We're looking for concepts from everyone and anyone who's interested to submit us concept papers on how you would design the market. And then we've put together a great panel of 5 of the energy industry's top thought leaders. Actually, Jigger, who loves to be so outspoken, is probably our most outspoken reviewer. But we've got a great diverse panel of 5 reviewers, including Jim Rogers, who's the former CEO of Duke, Jigger, and 3 others, who are going to look at the concepts that are submitted and come to a consensus around the top 3 to 5 concepts that they think are most worthy of national debate and discussion. So essentially, sort of in the second half of next year, we'll be using forums like this conference, hopefully, the NAREC conference, SPI, other big high visibility energy industry meetings and media outlets to really create this discussion about these ideas. And then, our hope would be in sort of the longer term perspective would be then we can start talking about, okay, can we actually begin to create some transition plans from, let's come back to reality, come back to specific state markets, and can we create some transition plans, some roadmaps that show how we might get from the status quo to one or more of those 51st state concepts. So that's the idea. We're really excited about it. People love the idea. I think it's a great exercise. And anyone who's interested, there is a website, which, my gosh, SEPA51.org. which has all the information. So we're excited about it.
Great. We're excited to hear what it comes up with next year. I want to note I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end of this panel, so please prepare your thoughts. I'll ask a couple more questions now, and then we'll have you raise your hands with questions. But I want to ask one question of Tom and then Jim, which is related to one of the questions we had in the crowdsource session last time, which is about utilities owning and installing, but I think particularly in this case owning and rate basing, say, residential solar. So this is a current area of debate in Arizona because APS and TEP have proposed programs that would allow them to own and rate base residential solar. I think at least based on the voting here, there's a broad expectation that other utilities might consider it over the next few years. So the question here is, should investor-owned utilities in their own regulated territory be allowed to own and rate base residential solar ever? And if so, under what conditions? Or are there any limitations to it? So I'm curious to hear Tom's perspective and then Jim's.
Well, I think Sanjay again touched on this quite well in the previous session. I think I don't have any sort of fundamental principled opposition to utilities doing it. I think that there are, however, pretty profound regulatory hurdles to doing it, and Sanjay touched on those. I'll elaborate on those. I think for better or for worse, I actually, true confessions, I wrote my PhD dissertation about 20 years ago basically on this topic, on the role of utilities in emerging technologies, using PV as a case study, and I looked very carefully at the antitrust implications of utilities getting involved in just the way we're talking about. So it's dated, but I should actually go back and reread it myself because it certainly has some bearing on the issues we're talking about. I think the main concern is from a regulator's perspective, is whether or not the utilities have anything incremental to offer in what is very clearly a highly competitive market, right? So, the presumption I think on the regulator's part is or should be that if there's a highly competitive open market with ample competition that's serving that market, then there really isn't a legitimate justification for the utilities getting involved. But if there are some kinds of, arguably some market failures that the utility can fill, right, that some incremental market demand or need that the utility can fill through participating in the market, then I think the regulators should be willing to consider it. I think the risk is, there's obviously benefits to having the utilities involved from, if you look at it not from the perspective of any particular, dealer installer in the room, who probably, superficially doesn't like the competition, but the question is market expanding? And I think, one quick take is that the utilities really, by law, shouldn't be allowed to take advantage of their status as a regulated utility to compete unfairly in a competitive market, right? Well, when you think about the advantages the utilities have, they're virtually all associated with their status as a regulated entity, right? They have essentially monopoly access to their customer base. They have a low cost of capital that's certainly tied to their regulated market opportunity and so on. So the very things that make them in some ways attractive as market entrants, right, because they have ready access to customers and so on, is the very thing that according to antitrust law, we really shouldn't be allowing them to take advantage of. So I think Sanjay also said, if they want to set up an unregulated subsidiary to compete with a Chinese wall between the regulated and affiliate operations, then they could do that.
Right.
And that takes care of the potential anti-competitive impacts, but A, it's not your question, and B, it essentially eliminates the utility's advantage, which in some ways is the very thing we want them to benefit from.
Right. So Jim, from your perspective, one, should utilities be allowed to own and rate base solar in their own territory? And second, do you want to be in the business of doing that?
I think you have to first ask a question. The question is this, what fulfills the mission of the utility? The utility is a monopolistic entity, and the concept behind a monopoly is to provide a public service that the economics would not justify having multiple players participate. Now, having said that, I don't think it makes sense for us to go out and suggest that I, as a utility, want to compete against Borrego Solar to put solar on rooftops. There are plenty of market participants who want to do that. So from a utility perspective, it doesn't necessarily make sense that it's not a monopolistic activity that's in line with the business we provide. Now asking the question, though, should the utility set up a non-regulated entity to do that? We've elected not to, and the reason we've elected not to is for the very same reason that I said part of my role is to protect the interest of the customers, to make sure that the customers are all provided with a fair and equal opportunity to either participate in the market that they want or to take services that they just feel are vital and that's all they need. But the same token, the best way to do that is to make sure that they have the proper price signals and that they're treated fairly and equitably. It wouldn't make sense for me to then set up a non-regulated entity to go in and take advantage of market inefficiencies. I just don't think that's the right message. First off, it then creates a conflict of, well, then should we actually then try to protect the interest of the customer on the other side? And that is our first and foremost goal. We have to protect that interest. Right. And I just don't see how you can put the two of them together at this moment. Now, there are other companies who are going to suggest it. And by the way, I think there's a misrepresentation of what some other utilities are doing. For example, if you take Tucson, Tucson is not going in and competing against Borrego Solar or somebody else to put solar on a rooftop. What they're saying is, we want access to your roof and we will give you certain rights to do that as a utility product. And they're putting it on their side of the meter to do that. So I think that's a different...
Well, but you can't have two solar systems on the same roofs. They're competing to the extent that the same customer could have gone with the Solar City or go with the TEP program.
And I think that they still provided that opportunity, but one of the big hurdles that a lot of people have been saying is, in order to get a significant amount of solar or wind or anything else, you have to have the capability to install it at some location. Mm-hmm. And there are some customers who don't want to deal with it on their own, and they're willing to lease out their roof space. And there are roof spaces that can accommodate more than just that. But I think it's, in our case, we, as I said, I mentioned earlier, put together this community solar initiative. We didn't put together the community solar initiative and said we're going to own it and rate base it. We actually suggested, because we think it's in the customer's best interest, to go out and actually contract with people like Borrego and third parties to install something, aggregate it, and give access to people who can't put it on their roof. Condominiums, apartments, small businesses that lease their facilities. They don't have access, and we think that they should have an equal access there, which is what our community solar initiative was intended to do. But it wasn't a function of, and we're going to invest it, own it, operate it, and we're going to put it in our rate base because we can hold that market to our own. It doesn't make sense for us to do that.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that. I think this, I'm sure, is controversial just within the room, but I totally agree with what Jim just said. To me, the more interesting question is, how can, as I sort of said a minute ago, is how can utilities participate in the market in a way that actually helps expand the market? And to me, community solar has the potential to be a
Right.
great win-win in that respect. And so I think that's a point maybe you want to pick up on, maybe you don't, but I just wanted to say that briefly.
Yeah,
Well,
and I will tell you, we have 500 utility members. We're talking to most of them on a very regular basis. I don't think that there's one of them that isn't interested in community solar. Community solar is the number one thing that every utility we talk to wants to get our advice on.
I do want to go back to one other idea that I've heard bandied about and that I'm somewhat enamored of and curious to get your take on with regard to utilities being able to expand the market. And so this would be a place where they actually would potentially play in residential, but one could make an argument that is market expansion, which is with either low-income customers or customers with low FICO scores. Right? Because right now, that market is well underserved. If you're a homeowner with a low FICO score, which is not a gigantic group, you certainly are going to have a hard time getting a lease or a PPA for a solar system. So why not have a utility design a program like the APS proposal, but restricted to people with FICO scores under 680 or whatever number you want to give? Does that meet your definition of market expansion, or does it sort of sit outside that?
I'm going to jump in because
Please.
I think our community solar provides exactly that. It provides an opportunity. In fact, one of the things we put forth in our application is this gives an opportunity for lower income groups to have a participation. And we fell as the backstop, meaning if there's a default, the utility steps in and purchases it. So the developer is actually held to a much better standard than if they're trying to sell it on their own.
So, so that's true. That makes sense. Why not also offer those customers rooftop solar, though?
again, it falls back to the same thing I mentioned earlier, is
For the system.
if the rates aren't designed properly, are we then taking advantage of market opportunities that shouldn't be there?
I think the community solar approach that Jim described is also just more of a clear win-win, right? You can site a larger project, capture the economies of scale associated with larger projects. You can site it in a place that has better solar insulation.
Provides benefits to the grid.
Provides benefits to the grid if you locate it correctly. So, and you can have customers essentially, purchasing shares in that system effectively. Now, there's lots of different designs for community solar, and it's becoming like smart grid. It means, if you talk to 1,000 different people, you get 1,000 different definitions of what it is. So, devil's in the details. But I like that sort of solar shares model where people, including low-income people, or people of, not low-income but more moderate means, or people who are apartment renters, all the things that we've touched on. There's a huge, I've seen some figures that suggest at least 2/3 of residential customers across the U.S. essentially are precluded from owning their own rooftop PV system.
Yeah, and REL estimated it at like 75%.
Yeah,
Right.
and in terms of expanding the market, when you think about customers' actual behavior, yes, there are lots of customers that, if you come knocking on the door as a solar company, they're ready to make the switch over, but there are a lot of customers that aren't, right? Human nature is, we're just sort of going to stick with what we've got, and you look at, states that have restructured and customers have choice of their electricity supplier, and if you look at the percentage of customers that actually choose a supplier other than their incumbent utility, it's a very small percentage. And so, that really makes me wonder if a utility has something to offer to customers from whether it's community solar or something else, I really believe you're going to expand the solar market at a much faster pace than you would if the utility doesn't have something to offer its customers.
And by the way, one of the things my PhD research many years ago unearthed was that, it reduces sort of to this. People don't like their utilities, but they trust their utilities.
That's
so I know
right.
that sounds kind of contradictory, but it's really very widely true.
Yeah, and that's a trend we're seeing in the conversations. Back to your question about what do the conversations look like in the boardroom or with the utility executives. It's a conversation around the utility becoming the trusted energy advisor and then expanding that into trusted energy partner for their customers. So, and it's not just about solar. It gets back to how do you optimize for the customer all of these solutions that they have? How do you be a solution provider for each of your customers? It may be a combination for one customer of solar storage and EV, or it might be something different for a different customer, but the utility can become that resource for them and do it in partnership with the solar industry and other technology and solution providers without crowding them out of the market.
And I think we have a responsibility to provide the information to the consumer so they can help make their own educated choice. Because it isn't just about solar. There are a host of technologies that can provide an opportunity for the customer to be a part of the equation.
Right. So after the conference is over, we're send you all a link to Tom's PhD dissertation. You can all read that.
Have fun with that.
Yeah. So enjoy. It's our gift to you. I want to take some time for questions from the audience here. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand, and we've got some mic runners coming around.
And maybe while we're waiting, one thing, I know we've only got 8 minutes left. One thing I wanted to make sure is on people's radar, if you haven't seen it yet, is the announcement by E.ON last week in terms of completely separating into two distinct investor-owned companies, essentially, with different shareholders. So E.ON in Europe is going to become a company, they're spinning off all of their upstream and generation assets into a brand new company, different name, different shareholders. The existing E.ON company is going to be focused on the distribution system, renewables, and customer solutions. So I think it's really interesting to watch. I mean, it's sort of the next step in what's happening in Germany and Europe, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, what I found surprising about that was they made that announcement. They had clearly put all this thought into it, all this work into it, and they had this whole slide deck, and they can't come up with a name for the new company. The whole deck has it. It's called New Company.
Newco, yeah.
You just need a name. All right, hands up if there are any questions from the audience.
Everybody wants lunch.
Well, thank you.
While we're waiting and seeing if there's any other questions, I just wanted to note another big announcement. I mentioned I was in Hawaii last week, and another very significant announcement in my view is NextEra's proposed acquisition of the Hawaiian Electric Company and its sister utilities.
What do you view as the potential impact of that on solar?
I think it's a little hard to say. You know, I heard a lot of the discussion last week centered around the and I'm going to say this, it's pretty provocative, but you know, which NextEra company is going to show up, right? NextEra Energy Resources, the IPP, that's the country's, you know, largest and many would argue most effective, you know, developer of large-scale renewable power plants, or its sister company, Florida Power and Light, which is, you know, has earned a reputation, I think, as a relatively obstructionist, you know, investor-owned utility, not particularly friendly to distributed solar within its grid. So, you know, which of those companies shows up to run the show in Hawaii, I think, will be pretty telling.
Right.
I think there's also a question there too about how can you really use, I think, any part of the Hawaiian Islands, but maybe even the Big Island in particular, as a real testing bed, right? Because, I mean, someone told me a couple of days ago, it's only a couple hundred megawatts of total load on the island, right? So I know, I mean, there's obviously a huge amount of renewables there already, but, you know, can you actually prove out that a microgrid works there in a real way, right? Can you actually deploy the right amount of storage, and where do you do it? And can you even, I mean, think about actually, you know, revamping the grid, starting over, right? And I mean, there are those sorts of discussions going on.
It could be
I
the
think, too.
51st state.
Could be.
If only it weren't already the 49th.
That's right.
Right, exactly. I was
Yeah.
going to say.
Come on, 49th and 51st all at once.
Okay, unless, oh, I see one in the back. Oh, no. Okay, I'm going to ask one final question then that I want everybody to answer, so we have time to do that, which is, let's look, say, 20 years in the future, so 2034. What's your best guess as to the role that utilities will have in the solar market at that time? Will it look like it does today? Utilities will manage the grid. Solar will be a mix of behind the meter and in front of the meter, and utilities will be managing to make sure that there's sufficient reliability, or will something meaningful change in any given direction, and if so, which direction? Jim, maybe I'll have you start this one. We'll come back.
I think I would answer that by saying I think utilities will be decoupled, because I think that is a barrier that does exist throughout the country in different areas. Now, having said that, I think that solar will be part of the overall portfolio that serves our customers' needs, and that will include energy storage, it will include wind, it will include biogas, biomass, geothermal, a host of different types of technologies. And I think at the end, what will happen is gas will be a residual part that will help balance at certain times and deal with other certain issues. But, I mean, as I said, our company right now, we're at 32%. We'll break 40% within the next couple of years. We made a commitment that we're going to have a cleaner future for our customers. And as we can continue to see new technologies advance that provide for new technologies to be economic alternatives to fossil fuels, you'd be crazy not to pursue it.
Right. Julia, in this 51st state that will exist throughout the country in 20 years.
Yes, so we do not believe there will be one answer, and that relates to both the 51st State Initiative and to your question generally. You know, I think that there are, even 20 years from now, it's going to be different in different parts of the country. The U.S. electricity market is not one similar structure today, and I think over the next 20 years of evolution, 20 years from now, it's still not going to look the same from region to region. So I think, you know, there may be a couple of models that sort of emerge in different pockets, but I don't think we can look and say there will be one way in which utilities are engaged. I do think that solar 20 years from now will be a significant part of most utilities' energy portfolio, but the big question, I think, is more around what will, on the customer side, what will that relationship look like between the utility and the customer, and that I think there will be different answers to that question.
Dave?
So I think it's reasonably safe to say that the combination of solar and storage will be in the money pretty much everywhere, 20 years from now. And so then the question becomes, and for me that means that I don't think the grid ever goes away, but I think it becomes increasingly local, right? And so you get into a much more distribution-focused game. You're looking at congestion a lot more closely at the nodal level. You're managing the grid on a local basis in real time. You've figured out how to really use smart meter data. And so, you get to a much smarter localized grid. And I struggle to see a world in which, to the point about what is the role fundamentally of a utility, it's for a regulated monopoly. I struggle to see that picture existing without the role of the utility in some form. I agree with what you're saying, which is I think it will vary a little bit by market, but I think fundamentally, the elephant in the room with an audience like this is the utility going away? And I don't think the utility is going away. I think it will look different.
Tom?
I agree. Of the answers so far, I think I'm most closely aligned with Dave. I think I'll elaborate on that a little bit. I mean, I see the utility as playing a very important continuing role of essentially the operator of the distribution system and the transmission system. I think that they'll be handling what will essentially be a universal network of prosumers, producers, consumers. I think they'll be largely indifferent through their regulatory frameworks with whether people are pulling power from the grid or feeding power onto the grid. They'll be doing both those things in a non-discriminatory fashion. And one key point is it's not just about the distribution system. I just wanted to go back to something Jim said, which is today, and in my view for the foreseeable future, the lowest cost renewables are large-scale wind and solar power plants. And we need to keep our eye on the prize, which is figuring out ways to continue expanding large-scale wind, I know it's not a wind conference, and large-scale solar, okay, and finding ways to deliver those resources to the grid universally. So I don't envision a bunch of isolated distribution systems that are not interconnected, because there are benefits to having those distribution systems interconnected to each other through ISOs and otherwise, and there are benefits to having all of those distribution systems connected to the lowest cost sources of incremental renewable power. Now that said, I also think the distribution system shifts are going to be really important in that, and this is where I agree with Dave, I think the customers are essentially going to become the de facto balancing authorities on a little tiny basis, right? Even down to the residential level, residential, commercial, industrial customers, microgrids that are aggregates of those customers are all going to essentially be able to play a role in helping to handle the grid integration challenges associated with very high penetration of renewables, which is what we all want to see.